So, Bob, could you please tell me about your enlisted time and what branch you're in, about how long it took?
The question is, how long was I in? I was in for, well, my obligation was 6 years, and I was on active duty about 3.5 or 4 years. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I was in military intelligence. That was my branch of service. I'd gone to Fort Bragg, North Carolina for the infantry school, and then after that I went to intelligence school, which then was in Baltimore, Maryland, and now it's in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And then I went to the 82nd Airborne, which is located in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, before I went to Vietnam. While I was in Vietnam, I met a guy that was a colonel, a full colonel, and he interviewed me to come back to the United States and go to work for him. And I worked in the Pentagon for a year after I came back to the United States after Vietnam.
Thank you very much. Could you please tell everyone what the biggest lesson you learned from your service was?
Well, probably the biggest lesson I learned in the service is discipline. I was somewhat disciplined, but I learned a lot of discipline in the military. I also learned about being prepared, being ready for anything that might happen to you, and it probably saved my life at least twice.
That's a really nice note, Bob. If every stater learned just one thing this week, what would you want that to be?
If every stater learned one thing this week, what would it be? I think the friendship, the companionship that you form at Boy State is most important, as well as changing your life. This can be a life-changing experience. It's been taught that way to us as counselors and people involved with the American Legion, and I firmly believe that this can really change your life.
Thank you, Bob. How has the armed forces changed you?
How has the armed forces changed me? Well, number one, it taught me a lot more safety than I ever had before. I was a kid off the street in Kansas City. I lived in a middle class neighborhood and mostly blue collar classes. And when I went in the military, I was I was an athlete in college, and I learned, how to stay in good shape, that sort of thing. But then when I went in the military, you had to be prepared all the time for any contingency. And as an officer, you have to teach your troops that. For example, the last duty station I had in Washington, D.C., I worked on some pretty interesting things. Number one is we did some major spy cases involving, one of them was a lieutenant colonel who was selling military secrets then to the Russians for money. And the way that we got onto him was, he was in Germany, and all of a sudden one day he owned a big castle on the Rhine River. He owned 3 or 4 Mercedes-Benz cars. He had a sailboat and a yacht. So people became suspicious of him about how he got all this money to buy all these items. And come to find out he was selling military secrets to the Russians. So they brought him back to the United States, and they put him in the Pentagon in a non-denominational type setting, or a case where they could feed him information and he could feed that to the Russians, which was very insignificant, or lying information, basically, which he did do. And we caught him actually in a park in Washington, D.C., exchanging a envelope with military secrets in it for money from the Russian intelligence. We got ready to try him in this sort of thing, and they didn't actually try him because he actually entered a plea. And instead of getting the death sentence for treason, he got a life sentence at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Leavenworth. They stripped him of all his rank, so he didn't get to retire. He didn't get any other benefits out of the military, and basically his life was done. That was one of the important things that we did, one of the important things that happened. Another one was, it was an interesting time in history, and recently they've had a lot of things on TV about the 50th anniversary of these particular things. Number one was Bobby Kennedy, who was the president's brother, John Kennedy. He was assassinated while he was running for political office. He was running for president, and he was killed in Los Angeles, and they brought his body back to Washington, D.C., and they had a funeral for him in Washington, D.C., where he was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery next to his brother, John Kennedy. Now, shortly before that, in April of 1968, and they've got this has been on the 50-year news anniversary lately, Martin Luther King was killed. And he was killed in Memphis, Tennessee, and they brought his body back to Washington, D.C. to have a funeral procession in Washington, D.C. Now, this was a very upheaval time in history, and there were a lot of people that were upset about his death, and consequently, all across the United States, in a lot of cities, they had a lot of riots. They had people that were looting, and had people that were breaking into businesses and this sort of thing during that time. And while I was in the Pentagon, I had 55 guys that worked for me that were special agents, and they patrolled the district at night because they had a curfew. The government imposed a curfew on Washington, D.C. from 7 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. And this is springtime. And so there were a lot of people that were looting, robbing, this sort of thing, breaking into buildings. And I'll never forget, there was this one incident. There was this little gang of kids that were probably 12 to 5 or 6, something like that, and they were going down the street. While they were going down the street, they threw a rock through a shoe store. And at the shoe store, a lot of these older kids got these shoes on, these new shoes on, they ran out the door. Well, there was one little kid, he's probably about 5 or 6 years old. He goes in the shoe store and gets a box of shoes about this high. And he takes the shoes out, sits down on the curb like this, and starts trying the shoes on to see which ones would fit him. And of course, we didn't have the authority to arrest anybody. We could detain them, but we didn't want to detain no 5-year-old kids, so we just told them, get on out of here. We didn't enforce what we did. But that was kind of dangerous too, because we got shot at patrolling at night by snipers on different buildings and stuff like that. That was during the riots of 1968. And those riots went on. They had big ones in Detroit, Los Angeles. They even had some in Kansas City, not to the extent that Washington did. Probably 15% of Washington got burned up, got burned down, and was affected during that thing. When I was in Vietnam, some of my experiences there were pretty interesting. I worked a lot with POWs, and it was very difficult once somebody got captured to ever get out. I'd say one person in 1,000 escaped or got out once they was captured. And they told us in our training, if you're ever captured, keep trying to escape, keep trying to escape. But if you were captured, you were beaten, you were tortured, you hardly ever got anything to eat there as a POW. You might get a roll of, maybe a bowl of rice, maybe once every 2 or 3 days, but you never really ate very well or anything like that. And that was for most of the people that were in the bush when they were captured. The guys that were the flyers, like that were captured in North Vietnam, Senator John McCain was one of those guys. He was in captivity for 7 years. But one time we got to interview a guy that was escaped from up around Hanoi, and he made his way all the way to the coast, which is about 60 miles. And he escaped and evaded every night by hiding so that nobody had seen. And he worked his way finally to the edge of the sea. And once he got to the edge of the sea, still in North Vietnam, and there was a Marine helicopter flying over, and they saw him, but he was dressed in black pajamas like most of the natives would wear and so forth like that. So they started shooting at him, and he ran back in the bush back there and came back out with a big stick and wrote USA like that. They come back over like that, and they saw this, and he stripped off his clothes off, so they could see he was an Oriental, they reached down and picked him up, and that's how he got out. I got out. I had a lot of experiences in Vietnam. Another time I was on a courier mission. I was carrying very top secret information to one of our outposts up in Quang Tri, and we were taking off and coming back to Saigon from Quang Tri. And Quang Tri, the airlines over there were run by the CIA. They were CIA planes, and there was like 6 people on the planes. So we was taking off from the airport and take off like this and start to turn like this, and they started shooting at our tail. They shot our tail off, and we got down and nobody got hurt. Thank God nobody got injured. We was only like 200, maybe 250 or 300 feet up in the air like this. We got turned around so we could get back down. One guy got some pretty good abrasions out of it, but other than that, nobody got hurt. But there are a lot of things over there. One thing about Vietnam is you never knew who your enemy was. It could be the guy that was taking care of your cars. It could be the guy that was the maids that took care of your house, or it could be anybody. One of the favorite things they like to do was when you'd be driving down the street in a Jeep or in a car, they had these guys they call cowboys, which were young teenage kids that were riding like Lambretta motorcycles, and they'd come by and throw grenades and stuff in your vehicle trying to hurt you, trying to blow you up. Those are some of the things I really remember a lot about the service. I had an interesting career in the service, but I knew when I was in the 3rd grade I wanted to be a lawyer, so I got out of the military, and I went back to Washburn Law School. There's 2 law schools in the United States. There's KU and there's Washburn, but I was told by a lot of lawyers, if you want to be a trial lawyer, go to Washburn, and that's where I went, and that's where I graduated from. And then I went back to Wyandotte County, where I'm from originally, started practicing law, and I mostly did criminal law and divorces. That was the 2 things I did. And a lot of people say, what's the difference between a criminal and divorce? What's the difference? No difference, really. But anyway, I had an interesting career, and I was a part-time judge in several places, and really enjoyed my career.
What does it mean to you to be part of the American Legion?
Okay, well, the American Legion to me is it's really like a fraternity. All the people in there are veterans. They've been through the military. They've been through some sort of a war situation. You have to be involved in a combat situation or in a war zone or in an active time when the United States is at war with somebody. And the camaraderie is a lot like you have here at Boise State. By the end of this week, a lot of guys here will form friendships with people they should have never seen, never met, or never would meet in life. And that's kind of the way the American Legion is too. And those people there, you get to know these people, and you get to where you can trust these people. You can find out who does the work and who doesn't do work and who can you rely on, and this sort of thing. But the friendships that you meet in the American Legion are just great, and the programs that the American Legion have are great, just like this Boise State program. I'm sold on it. I love it, and I think it's always going to be here. We are trying to preserve it as much as we can and keep it growing. And you guys have been an integral part of that, and I really appreciate you guys coming around. And besides that, you're getting some job training on what you may do the rest of your life. You may be journalists, or you may be photographers, So that's all.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. And
Okay.
is there anything else you'd like to say to our viewers?
No, I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad you guys are all here. And I hope some of you come back next year as counselors.
Thank you.
Okay.